When we think of the Middle Ages, we typically don't imagine the Middle Ages as being a time of great learning and scholarship. However, there was intellectual activity afoot, and the epicenter of that activity was without a doubt Baghdad, the Abbasid capital. And it was here that from the 9th to the 13th centuries we saw a period known as the Islamic Golden Age. In this video, I want to give a brief introduction to what this Golden Age was, and also give sort of a general idea of the kinds of thinkers and products that this period produced. And at the end, I will also indulge in a more modern debate as to the relative importance of the Islamic Golden Age. So without any further ado, let's get this going. In 750, when the Abbasids triumphed over the Umayyads, they decided to build a new capital city. The Umayyads had built their capital at Damascus in Syria, and that was a reflection of their belief that their primary struggle going forward would be with the Christian Byzantine Empire, and that would be the most important place for a caliph to be. However, the Abbasids were less interested in the West than the Umayyads had been, and they were less interested in the Byzantines. So they decided to find a capital that was more central to their land as a whole. There were also conquests in the east, as we've already talked about. So in 762, they founded the city of Baghdad, which is about 50 or so miles from the old city of Babylon from ancient times. Now, Baghdad would rise to a population of about 1.2 million, making it pretty comparable to Rome at its height, and it would have been the world's largest city for quite a while. The most famous thing in Baghdad was the House of Wisdom, which lasted from the 9th to the 13th centuries. We'll talk about that in greater detail. Baghdad, as the capital of this expansive empire, would become one of the leaders in global trade. It would also become a religious authority center for the Islamic world. This is where the great theologians would train. Now, obviously, there were other centers of culture, such as Al-Andalus, which we'll talk about in its own video. But Baghdad was really the place, if you had to choose a place. And because of all the wealth, the population concentration, and its position more or less in the center of the old world, it also became the global center of learning. So let's talk about that aspect of Baghdad more. The origins of the House of Wisdom are actually fairly mundane. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who ruled from 786 to 809, decided to begin a personal library, and he was apparently quite the bibliophile. And then when he died, his son Al-Mamun came to power in 813, and at some point during his reign, he decided to develop this library into what we call the House of Wisdom. And to do this, he kept enhancing this collection, and he began to invite scholars from all around the world to come to this House of Wisdom and translate foreign works into Arabic, and also use the wisdom that they gain from those works to create new works of scholarship in Arabic. By the mid-9th century, so not too long after its foundation, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad was the world's largest library, and in many ways it was more or less Alexandria Part 2, if you're familiar with the library at Alexandria that was founded by the Ptolemies, and which continued until the late Roman or early Byzantine period in some form or fashion. As was the case with the Alexandrian Museum, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad pretty much covered every known avenue of human learning that was available at the time. They collected and studied Greek, Persian, Indian, and Syriac text. There are many of these texts and other achievements which had very long-lasting effects and were not really replaced or surpassed for many centuries. One great example is that Hunan produced a medical text in the 9th century which became standard in Renaissance Europe. And by the way, I have no idea if that's how you actually pronounce his name, Hunain, something like that. Doesn't matter. You can read it for yourself, and if you know the correct pronunciation, then good for you. There were also many advancements in optics made during this time, and that leads to the world's first observatory. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think that they established 2 observatories using funds from the House of Wisdom. This also would have enabled the later development of things like the microscope. One of the big limitations on earlier ancient science was the lack of advanced optics to enable things like telescopes and microscopes. So this would then enable further discoveries, and obviously once the telescope reaches Europe, you have people like Copernicus and other famous astronomers who are able to then benefit and build upon that achievement. One of the works that was produced in Baghdad was the Book of Ingenious Devices, and one of the devices that was listed out of about 100 was a self-playing instrument. And that is a fairly advanced thing to have in the Middle Ages. It would be like a self-playing piano. I'm not sure exactly what the instrument was, but if it was able to play itself, then that makes it an automated machine. And this is something being built out of medieval materials, so it's a pretty impressive thing. Another thing that you probably suffered through in school, I know I did, was algebra, which was more or less invented by Arabic mathematicians, and also we have Arabic numerals. Arabic numerals are an outgrowth of Hindu numerals, so that there's where studying the Indian text came in, and algebra builds upon and systematizes a lot of discoveries by Greek mathematicians such as Euclid. So again, this kind of links together this idea of collecting and studying the works of past civilizations and then systematizing or building upon them with new learning. So this is more or less what the House of Wisdom was there to do. And now let's look at a couple of other famous products of the House of Wisdom. Probably the single most famous product of the House of Wisdom was the scholar Avicenna. He lived from 980 to 1037, and during the course of his life, he wrote 480 works on all kinds of different things, making him very similar to someone like Aristotle, who also wrote across the known spectrum of human knowledge. So I guess in many ways you could call him the medieval Arabic Aristotle. That would be a pretty fair title for him. However, whereas Aristotle was mostly known as someone who was interested in the material universe, Avicenna was most known as a doctor, even though only about 40 or so out of those 450 works dealt with medicine, and more of them actually dealt with philosophy. The Book of Healing is one of his most famous works, and this is a combination of philosophical and scientific information that you can use to create healing solutions. But his most famous work is the Canon of Medicine, and this was a medical encyclopedia that was in use as late as 1650 at some universities. So that became a major stepping stone forward in the development of medicine. Now, what else did Avicenna write about? Well, to name a few things, astronomy, alchemy. I guess he didn't figure out that alchemy is BS, but neither did most people until much later. Geography, geology, psychology, Islamic theology, logic, math, physics, poetry. Basically, if you can imagine it, and it was something that someone in the Middle Ages could have possibly cared about, then Avicenna wrote at least one, and probably at least more like a dozen different works on that subject. Possibly the most famous product of this period ended up being the 1001 Nights, which is a collection of folklore that was current in the Abbasid period and was then collected and put together. Some of these tales came from Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Indian, and Jewish sources, so many of these tales have been repeated in other contexts, and they were simply altered to fit the conceit of this overall work. Now, what is the conceit of that work? Well, there was a caliph or sultan somewhere who was upset with one of his former wives for betraying him, and that caused him to have a very negative view of all women. So in order to avoid being betrayed by women, he would sleep with a woman one night, and after taking her virginity that night, he'd have her killed the next morning so she wouldn't have a chance to betray him. Well, he quickly ran out of virgins, and eventually the last one left was his vizier's daughter. So this daughter ended up being a very clever woman who ended up telling him stories every night. And what she'd do is leave one story incomplete, so that way he'd have to wait till the next night to hear the rest. And then she'd begin a new story that same night. And this went on for 1001 nights. And at the end of that time, he decided that he actually did love her, and he didn't execute her, and they lived happily ever after. And while there are many very famous stories that are associated with this collection, if you look at the original Arabic text, Three of those stories are not actually in there, and those are Aladdin's Wonderful Lamp, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and the Seven Voyages of Sinbad the Sailor. Those are added into European translations, such as English and French, but were not included in the original manuscript in Arabic. However, these also are authentic medieval Arabic tales, so putting them in there is not a horrible thing by any means. And obviously, these stories have had a tremendous influence on Western culture. We've seen all kinds of versions of these things being made in the plays or movies. Obviously, Disney's Aladdin was pretty popular in the 90s. So, you can see that this is a period in general which is producing lots of things that are culturally relevant, even to this very day. In conclusion, this label Islamic Golden Age is a descriptor for a time when the Middle East saw great scholarly production, creativity, and open-mindedness across the Islamic world, but especially centered in Baghdad. The traditional dates of the Golden Age are fairly arbitrary since they correspond exactly with those of the House of Wisdom, when it was founded in the early 9th century by Al-Mamun and then destroyed by the Mongols in 1258. However, there are some scholars who would like to extend that date all the way to the 15th or 16th centuries. I think that the traditional dates in this case are fairly fitting, although I do want to emphasize that there were plenty of innovations before and after this period, and we shouldn't necessarily be absolutely bound by any artificial dating systems when it comes to talking about periods of cultural production or something of that nature. So I hope that this has clarified what the Islamic Golden Age is, and I also hope that it will give you some indication of the importance of the contributions from this period to later civilization in the West.